Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Valley Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Carmen Imes, and today we're going to be discussing her book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters. The link to purchase the book is in the description below, including a link to her YouTube channel. And for those that do not know or are unfamiliar with her, Dr. Carmen Imes is an Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. She has a passion for helping students and other lay people engage the Old Testament and discover its relevance for Christian identity and mission. Since the release of her book, Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, Imes has appeared on more than 50 podcasts and radio shows and launched her own YouTube channel where she releases weekly Torah Tuesday videos. She is a guest blogger for Christianity Today, the Political Theology Network, and the Well InterVarsity's blog for women in the academy and professions. Imes is also a frequent speaker at churches, conferences, and retreats. She previously served as professor of Old Testament and program coordinator for Bible and Theology at Prairie College in Alberta, Canada. Before earning her PhD from Wheaton College, Carmen and her husband served as missionaries in the Philippines with SIME International, reaching out to ethnic minorities. Imes loves introducing students to the rich insights of the global church. Welcome to History Valley Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So why do you think it is common for Christians to often ignore the Old Testament law where it appears? What do you think causes that?
I think the Old Testament law does not wear relevance on its sleeve. It's regulating practices that we don't engage in. Most of us are not farmers. A lot of laws have to do with farming. It feels that the family structures are different, the social structures are different. And so I think that when Christians come to these texts, they don't really know what to do with them. How do we pick and choose which laws still matter? How do we decide how to live them out today, and who gets to decide that?
Do each of the four Gospels interpret the Old Testament in the same way or differently from one another?
That's a fascinating question. I don't think I've stopped to consider that particular question. What I find when I read the New Testament is that the New Testament authors are united in their approach to the Old Testament in that they see its ongoing relevance. So the Old Testament continues to serve as the source of authority and the source for ethical reflection. Even laws that don't seem immediately relevant to a New Testament context are evoked to help the early church think about how to honor God with their lives. So I don't know in particular with each gospel, but I think as a whole, the New Testament authors continue to revere the Old Testament.
I know it is often brought up by both Old and New Testament scholars alike that the Gospels appear to be influenced by the Septuagint. And some of them will point out that the Gospel of Matthew is quoting the Septuagint, not the Hebrew Bible. But does it appear anywhere that the New Testament goes back and forth on that? Like sometimes it's quoting from the Hebrew text instead of the translation?
Sorry, I think my camera
Yeah, I lost your video.
stopped working, and I don't know why, because it's right here and I'm right here.
That's all right.
Let me just try to plug it in again. I'll talk while I'm trying to plug this in. I
Okay.
would say that, yes, the New Testament authors seem to go, some of them seem to be drawing on the Septuagint. Others seem to be aware of the Hebrew text. There's debate about how much, to what degree they're aware of the Hebrew text, and whether they have that text right in front of them or whether they're working from memory. But I think it's safe to say that there's variety in how the New Testament approaches the Old Testament and what text they're reading.
Did early Christians really believe that John the Baptist was Elijah or Elijah reincarnated, I suppose? If so, is there something in the Old Testament that you think could have given them that impression?
Oh, great question. I don't. I am not. I'm not an early church scholar, so I haven't dug deeply into intertestamental literature, first century literature, to know kind of how those traditions developed. But my suspicion is that the early church would have seen John the Baptist in a similar role to Elijah, that they were expecting someone to come like Elijah. But again, I can't speak on that with authority because I'm not as familiar with that literature.
Some people think that when it is said in the New Testament, Christ brings an end to the law, but in other places it says Jesus came not to change one tittle of it and that he did not come to abolish it as a contradiction. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we sometimes misunderstand the word end. Jesus is the end of the law in the sense that he's the goal or fulfillment or the telos, if you will, of the law. He makes very clear that he hasn't come to set it aside, but he's come to fulfill it. And I would see Jesus' fulfillment of the law as not doing it so we don't have to think about it, but rather modeling covenant faithfulness. And I think part of where people get off track with this is they imagine that the Old Testament law was in place so that the Jews would be saved, that they would do these things to please God and then God would let them into heaven. That's a common Christian mischaracterization of the Old Testament. I think it's really essential to notice that God rescues the people from Egypt before he gives them the law. He saves them first, calls them his people, and then says, here's how I want you to live. And as I understand it, the law is a matter of mission, not a matter of getting saved, but a mandate for how to live now that God has brought you into relationship with himself. And so if we correct that misunderstanding of Old Testament law, then it makes more sense of how Jesus relates to it. Jesus is not, if the law was a means of salvation and Jesus is offering a way of salvation, then we don't need the law anymore. But if the law is not a means of salvation, if it's a matter of mission, here's how I want you to live in the world so that all will come to know me, then Jesus coming to live in that way faithfully provides a model rather than a replacement.
When you mention in the book that you wonder if the Israelites ever dream of Sinai, could you explain what you mean by that question to the audience?
Sure. Sometimes I like to use my imagination and kind of try to put myself in their sandals. And it's fascinating to me that so many amazing things happen at Sinai. They see thunder and lightning, and God speaks to them audibly from the heavens, and they receive the 10 Commandments, and God gives Moses the tabernacle dimensions, tells him how to build it. And then they build the tabernacle and God's presence comes down and they can see him visibly dwelling in their midst. It's an amazingly formative time for the people of Israel. This is where they become a nation. And yet, surprisingly, they don't seem to ever go on pilgrimages to Sinai. There's not a sense in which they're trying to go back and trying to recreate that moment. We have just a couple of exceptions to that. We have Elijah, who in a time of deep discouragement, when he wonders if the covenant might be called off, he goes back to Sinai to connect with Yahweh. And I think he does that because the nation of Israel at that time is so corrupt and they're so embroiled in the worship of other gods. The leadership is so oblivious to what Yahweh wants or at even hostile towards it, that he feels he needs to go outside Israel and kind of redo Sinai. So he meets with Yahweh on Mount Sinai, just like Moses did. So that's one exception. And then there's a moment in the book of Isaiah where the prophet says, "Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down." And he seems to be wanting a reset button to go back to Sinai because, again, the people have become so unfaithful to the covenant that they want a do-over. But strikingly, there never is a pilgrimage to Sinai that we know of. Instead, God's presence goes with them from the mountain into the promised land. And eventually they build a permanent temple to house God's presence. And so that's where they go on pilgrimage. There's no need to go to that mountain in the Arabian Peninsula because or in the Sinai Peninsula, because God isn't there in a way that he isn't already with them. So the presence of God becomes more important than the place.
We have a super chat question.
Sure.
Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Isaiah 45, 1-7 just read the Rashi commentary, and evidently Cyrus failed to build the temple and doomed the Second Temple period. Was Cyrus supposed to be the Messiah and failed? Is that why they're still waiting?
That's a fascinating question. Cyrus is called God's anointed in the book of Isaiah. God raises up Cyrus and anoints him for a task. And you might be aware that in the Hebrew Bible, the word for anointing is Mashiach. Mashiach would be anointed one. And there's a verbal form of that as well. And that's true of Cyrus. Now, I don't conclude from that Cyrus was supposed to be the Mashiach, the Messiah. There's a recent book out by Greg Goswell and Andy Abernathy called Messiah in the Old Testament. And I think they do a really good job of showing how messianic expectations develop over time. And in each part of the Old Testament, there's a different sense or a growing sense of what Messiah will be. But I would say that I'm not super I don't read a lot of rabbinic literature, so I can't speak to what the Jewish hopes continue to be, or how that developed over time after the New Testament period. But my own sense from reading Isaiah is not that Cyrus was supposed to be the Messiah, but that he is anointed by God for a particular moment in history. This moment in which God wants his people to go back and begin rebuilding. And he uses this pagan foreign king to be part of that process. He raises him up for his own purposes to give the green light to go back to the land. And Cyrus doesn't convert to the worship of Yahweh. We have no indication of that. But we do have indication that he plays this small role in the restoration of Israel. Of course, the result of that temple being built is a bit anticlimactic. Those who saw the previous temple wept because probably mixtures of tears of joy and tears of sorrow, because it just isn't like the old temple was. It's not nearly as glorious.
On occasion, Jesus referred to the Israelites as being his people. And the letter of Jude says that the Lord led a people out of Egypt. How do you think this relates to the Israelites being God's people in the Old Testament? I ask this in the context of, if the Israelites are God's people, how are they also Jesus' people at the same time?
Okay, so you're right that in the Old Testament, the language of my people is very specifically applied to the nation of Israel. And sometimes people struggle with that. Sometimes people who are reading the Old Testament say, why does God only care about the family of Abraham and he doesn't seem to care about all the other nations? So then I think it's important to go back and look at Genesis 12, verses 1-3, where God calls Abram out from the nations and says, I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing, and through you all nations will be blessed. And I will make you into a great nation, he says as well. And I think it's important for us to get that right first, that God chooses the Jews. God chooses Abraham and his family that become the Jewish nation so that all the nations of the world will experience God's blessing. So that's important to say first. Then when we get into the New Testament, I would say that Jesus is, and sometimes we kind of skip over this and miss this point, but Jesus is Jewish. He's born into a Jewish family. He has a Jewish heritage. He worships in the temple. He goes to synagogue. He's an observant Jew. And he is, as I understand it, he is indeed the Messiah that God had promised to send. And it's through faith in Jesus as the Messiah who God sent to restore his people to himself that we experience that restoration. So for those who are Jewish, the Messiah comes to restore the covenant relationship. For those who are not Jewish, the Messiah comes to usher us into that same covenant relationship. So I don't see there being an end to God's covenant with Abraham. I see that covenant persisting through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. And so any of us who are not Jews then become part of the people of God. And we see this, I think, most clearly in the book of First Peter. At least that's my go-to passage to help illustrate this. In First Peter chapter 2, Peter is writing to believers in Jesus who are scattered throughout Asia Minor, and they are both Jewish and Gentile. They're mixed races. And he says to them, "But you are a chosen people," as if they're and that word, the word people, laos in Greek, is never used to describe the Gentiles in the Old Testament. It's always used when it's translating the Hebrew. That laos is always used to specifically describe God's covenant people. And it says you're a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. Those are titles that God gave to Israel at Sinai. And here Peter is just seamlessly applying them to a church made up of both Jews and Gentiles. And I think he does this because he sees the covenant hasn't come to an end. It's just expanded and now includes all those from the nations who want to be blessed through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah.
The Muslim apologist, thank you for your super chat. Would you consider Matthew 1:23 to be an accurate interpretation from the Old Testament?
Okay, let me turn there a moment. Matthew 1:23. All right, this will be fun. Matthew 1:23 reads, well, I'll start in verse 22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. So I like to talk about this passage with my students because it's, I think, a great example of a place where if we're not being careful, we'll actually overread the Bible or jump to conclusions about what it's saying. So Matthew is talking in Greek here, at least the text we have is Greek, and he is quoting from Isaiah 7:14. In the Hebrew, the word that is translated virgin in our Bibles is alma, which means a young woman who she could be a virgin or not. She could be married or not, but the point is that she's a young woman. And so where does Matthew get this idea that it's a virgin? Well, if you carefully read Isaiah 7, you find that you're plopped right in the middle of a very gritty historical reality in which King Ahaz is in a politically precarious situation. He has other nations who are coming to attack him, and he's nervous. And God sends the prophet Isaiah to reassure him, you don't need to worry about these other nations. Within a short time, they're going to disappear. You don't need to worry about these nations. And I'll give you a sign that you don't need to worry. The young woman will conceive and bear a son, and he'll be called his name will be called Emmanuel. And before that child grows up enough to know right from wrong, the land of the kings you dread will be laid to waste. So if that prophecy, if that announcement of Isaiah was about Jesus of Nazareth, it would be a very strange message of reassurance. If that's all he was saying is, hey, don't worry, I know you're under attack right now, but just hang on. In 800 years, I'm sending a solution to the problem. That would be not very reassuring to a king. And in fact, the text goes on to say almost immediately that Isaiah went into the prophetess, presumably his wife, and made love to her, and she conceived and bore a son. And that immediate fulfillment of that announcement tells me that for Isaiah, he's speaking about God's reassurance in this historically tricky situation. Now, you could say, based on what I've just said, well, hey, now Matthew's totally misusing Isaiah because he's applying it to a virgin birth 800 years later. But I actually think Matthew is justified in doing so, and here's why. If you continue to read past Isaiah 7 and 8, to chapter 9, it's the same context. Isaiah is still giving words of prophetic words of reassurance and announcements of coming judgment to King Ahaz. We get to the other Christmas verse about the son that will be born, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. And I think for Isaiah, it's very clear that he's no longer talking about his son, who was just born as a sign to King Ahaz, that there is coming a son down the road, and that son will be the end, the ultimate end to this destruction and difficulty. And so I think Matthew picks the one verse chapter 7, verse 14, as a signal that he has the whole context in mind. And so he is drawing on the Septuagint translation of Isaiah 7:14, which reads Parthenos, which actually is a virgin. So the Hebrew word alma, which means young woman, and the Greek word Parthenos, which means virgin, have some significant overlap because many young women are also virgins. So in terms of translation principles, it was an okay choice of a word. And I think Matthew sees this and he's like, ooh, I got it. We are in a situation of great pressure in which Rome is bearing down on us. And God is giving us a sign of reassurance that he will deliver us. And that sign is coming through the birth of a child. And this time it actually is from a virgin. So he takes this verse and uses it not to say this is only and always what that verse meant in Isaiah. Like it was only always about Jesus. No, he's seeing an even greater, fuller fulfillment of the same principles that were at work in the first initial fulfillment. And I think he's justified in doing so because Isaiah himself, by chapter 9, is looking out beyond his own lifetime to see that God will raise up a savior. So my short answer to your question about Matthew 1:23 is yes, I think Matthew is appropriately using Isaiah. But I think it's a little bit more complicated than the average Christian realizes when we're reading these verses at Christmas time.
How do you think Jesus and his followers viewed God's name? Do you think they referred to him by his actual name, or do they use a title, such as or the equivalent of Adonai, to avoid taking his name in vain?
It's a very good question, Jacob. I would say that we do seem to have evidence in the New Testament of circumlocution, of people talking around the name of God and not using it directly. There seems to be a deep reverence for the name. It's debatable whether that actually comes from an interpretation of the command not to take the Lord's name in vain. And that's, what I talk about more fully in my book is that I don't think that's what the command is telling us not to do. I don't think the command is saying, don't say God's name, don't say the divine name. Because in the close context, in Exodus, God instructs Moses to call him by name, to announce the word of Yahweh, and he says, this is how you are to remember me. So I think to read it that way actually contradicts its immediate context. But there was a practice of hesitation to say God's name by the time of the New Testament. And Jesus and the disciples appear to have participated in it, although it's difficult to tell for sure because we don't know how much license the gospel writers are taking as they record these stories. We do have evidence in ancient manuscripts that there was still a deep reverence for God's name when it occurred. So there's something called the nomina sacra. It's like a special way of writing just the divine name. And there's a short list of other titles that get written that way that are applied to Jesus as well as to God the Father and to the Spirit. So that gives us some early evidence of Trinitarian thinking and of associating Jesus, the Father, and the Spirit all with the divine name Yahweh.
You mentioned evidence of early Trinitarian thinking. Do you think Genesis 18:1-2 had any influence on early Christians believing in the Trinity? Because when Abraham looks up to God standing over him. It says the text goes on to say, "Behold, free men." That there's free. Like, he sees God. He looks up to see God, and there's free people there.
Yeah, another great question. And again, I feel like, I'd love to go study all these things more deeply and see what was the history of interpretation. Undoubtedly, this has been a part of this passage has been a fruitful source of reflection for Trinitarian thinking. I don't think that Abraham, when he looked up, was thinking, "Oh, there's three persons in the Godhead." I doubt that was Abraham's conclusion. I imagine that after the New Testament, people began to go back and then say, "Ooh, is this suggestive of that?" I think more likely is that in Abraham's day, there was a clear sense that there was something called the divine council, that God is not alone, but as a resident of the heavenly realm, he's attended by lots of other spiritual beings, angels, and various kinds of angelic beings, what the Hebrew Bible calls Elohim, which is a category, not a name. So we usually translate Elohim as God, and in English we've come to use the word God as though it's God's name, but it's a title and it's a category that includes within it any resident of the spiritual realm. So an angel can be called an Elohim. They belong to the class of beings that are non-physical, but they're spiritual. So I would assume that if Abraham has a sense that he's encountering a divine being, that it would not surprise him for there to be more than one, because surely there are angels attending God, or that this even is the angel of the Lord with some lesser angels to be part of the delegation.
Do you think the four Gospels interpret the Son of Man the same way, Daniel, Son of Man in particular, the same way, or differently from one another?
Boy, another good question. I again have not examined Son of Man in all four, so I can't give a definitive answer on that. But it does seem clear to me that Jesus' preference for referring to himself as the Son of Man is both an unveiling of who he is and a veiling of who he is. It functions kind of like a parable. We're told in John that Jesus tells parables, or maybe it's Matthew, so that they will not understand. And it cites Isaiah 6, that seeing they will not see and hearing they will not hear. He tells a parable, and some people get the deeper message and understand the claims that he's making, and others just kind of shake their heads and go, "Okay, that was a nice story." So I think Son of Man functions in a similar way. When Jesus he doesn't walk around saying, "Yo, I'm the Messiah. You've been waiting for me a long time." He said he's self-referential as Son of Man, and it seems like at the basic level, Son of Man simply means human. Ezekiel is called Son of Man all through the book. Whenever God addresses Ezekiel, he calls him Son of Man, and the sense seems to be mortal. "Oh, mortal, such and such." But you're right that in Daniel, the title Son of Man then takes on a greater significance, because one like a Son of Man comes on the clouds with glory and approaches the Ancient of Days. So it seems to be a human-like figure who approaches God and is given dominion and authority over all things. So by calling himself Son of Man, Jesus can at the same time evade charges of blasphemy, because technically all he said was human or mortal, but at the same time could be communicating that he is the representative figure to whom is given all authority and dominion over the world. And if you read Daniel's vision, there's the vision, and then there's the interpretation of the vision by the angel. And the vision is one like a Son of Man approaching the Ancient of Days. But in the interpretation of the vision, in a few paragraphs later, it's the holy ones of the Most High are the ones approaching the Ancient of Days. And so that figure, Son of Man, seems to be a representative of all the people of God who are pursuing holiness and are in right relationship with God. And so I think there's just so much here for us to chew on, because Jesus is himself, he acts himself, but he's also acting on behalf of all covenant members. And that, I think, is beautiful.
I wanted to go back to the subject earlier that we were discussing about Matthew quoting the Isaiah verse about
Sure. The virgin.
Yeah. There are many that are concerned with similar passages to that when the Old Testament's quoting, when the New Testament's quoting the Old Testament, like Psalm 22:16, for example. Because for dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me, they pierce my hands and my feet. And there are some that claim, okay, that's the New Testament's mistranslating that, or Christians are misunderstanding that. That's not talking about Jesus, lions or dogs encircling him and piercing him. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Oh, great question. I have done quite a bit of work on the Psalms, and I teach Psalms each semester, and so I love this question. I would say, so I've done quite a bit of work in Augustine's reading of the Psalms, and he would answer your question by saying, Psalm 22 is really Jesus talking. David can't say any of that. It's only true of Jesus, and it was always true of Jesus. And so it was like a predictive, or it was spoken ahead of time through the lips of David, but it really wasn't his life experience. My approach to Psalm 22 is quite different. I believe that when Jesus is quoting it, he is entering into the human experience of prayer, and his experience mirrors David's in some way. So the psalmist is in great distress in Psalm 22, and they are being surrounded by enemies, and there's lots of metaphor being used in Psalm 22. So dogs and lions and bulls surround me. These are things that are common. Those are common metaphors used in the psalm to describe enemies as wild animals. That's a very common trope in the Psalms, is enemies as wild animals. And so I don't think David was literally surrounded by dogs or bulls, but he's praying out of his distress. He's describing it like that because it's the best way he can put into words how threatened he feels. And Jesus likewise is not surrounded by dogs or bulls or lions. He's being surrounded by Roman soldiers and jeering crowds. But that experience of distress is consistently rendered metaphorically in the Old Testament, either as wild animals or as crashing waves. That the psalmist will say, they set traps for me, like a hunter hunted kind of metaphor. And so what I think is really beautiful about this is David in his distress prays. He feels abandoned, and he wants to know where God is and whether God will save him. And the beginning of the psalm is, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's articulating what it feels like when you're in distress and God does not seem to be rescuing you. But then by the time you get to the end of his psalm, he has this confidence that God will save. And he says, they will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. So I think Jesus on the cross, when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's remembering David's experience of distress, and he's finding those words appropriate to his experience of distress. And so he prays them. He joins in the fully human experience of suffering. And I think, like Matthew 1:23, to quote just the first verse of the psalm is a way of, it's like a hyperlink to the whole context. And in the context, it's not just an expression of distress, but also an expression of confidence that God really will save from his enemies. So that's how I approach the Psalms. I think, yes, Jesus often quotes the Psalms, prayed the Psalms, and I believe he does that because they so beautifully capture the human experience. And Jesus is signaling that he's entered fully into our human experience.
How do you think early Christians viewed the Sabbath day? Because many find it curious. The majority will go to church on Sundays. They don't, and they ignore the Sabbath. What's the deal there? And some claim that early Christians went to this, obeyed the Sabbath, and then later, for some reason, discarded it. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is another thing that I would love to study more deeply to kind of see historically how did this all play out. My sense is that what we have in the New Testament is Saturday is the Sabbath, begins Friday at sundown, and Saturday at sundown, and that's the day on which people met in the synagogue and refrained from work. So they had family time, rest time, and time at the synagogue. And then we're told Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. And that seems to have kicked off a tradition of followers of Jesus meeting for fellowship on the first day of the week. So that would be Sunday. Now, for quite a while, these Jewish followers of Jesus would have also kept the Sabbath and attended synagogue, been part of that synagogue community, because they didn't see following Jesus as a leaving their faith or converting to a new religion. Jesus, after all, was the Jewish Messiah. So they didn't stop being Jewish to follow him. And so they would have kept the Sabbath, attended synagogue, and then the next day, and probably every day, would have met together with other believers for meals, for fellowship. And at some point in history, there was more of a split between the church and the synagogue. And part of that came, I think, because the synagogue started to get concerned about those who claimed that Jesus was the Messiah and perhaps forced them out. I don't know if that came first or what. There was persecution that scattered people. There was kind of a parting of the ways. And again, I'm not a church historian to know all the details. But there has been a long history of anti-Semitism, almost a kind of overreaction to, okay, now that we can't meet in the synagogue, we're going to try to downplay Jesus' Jewishness. We're going to set aside the Hebraic roots, if you will, of our faith and just fully follow Jesus as Gentiles. So I don't imagine that the early disciples would have stopped keeping the Sabbath. It was one of the 10 commandments. There's no indication that Jesus said to set it aside. This is part of the rhythm God sets up for his people. But over time, as the church and the synagogue kind of went their separate ways, and there were more and more Gentile believers, Gentile followers of Jesus who didn't have that background, there seemed to be less of a concern about Sabbath keeping. So today you have a spectrum of views on Sabbath keeping. I grew up in a fairly conservative context, and for us, we considered Sunday to be the Sabbath. And there were lots of things you couldn't do on Sunday, like go shopping or spend money, eat out, do work. Like we didn't do yard work on Sundays. My dad was a remodeling contractor. He didn't go to clients' homes on Sundays. We didn't. I think we avoided homework as well on Sundays. But it wasn't. I don't remember us sitting down and making a decision of why we were going to do this on Sunday instead of Saturday. It's just what our church tradition had always been doing. So today there's a recovery of interest in the Sabbath. And I have students coming to ask me all the time about Sabbath, and they're beginning to see its importance. We live in a world of 24/7 connection to our devices, and it's hard to leave work behind. And so people, I think, are longing more now for a sense of rest and a regular rhythm of that. And so I have some friends who insist that we ought to do this on Saturday, just like the Jewish people do. I have other friends who say it doesn't really matter what day of the week you practice the Sabbath as long as you have this rhythm. And I'm not really sure whether the day matters. I think it mattered for Israel in part because they were collectively being a witness to the nations. We don't live in a theocracy now, and so I'm not sure how much collective witness is accomplished by us being all picking the same day to rest. But that's open for further discussion.
So in conclusion, you think that the early Christians and Jesus himself are far more Jewish than a lot of people give credit to?
Yeah.
Give credit to.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And I think there's a move today to try to rediscover the Jewishness of Jesus. And I think that's healthy and good. I've seen it be taken too far, where there's a sort of overemphasis on, oh, if we really want to pray and we really want to connect with God, we need to do it in Hebrew, and we need to sort of live like we're Jews. And I think Hebrew is not a special heavenly language. It's a language among all the languages. I think God is just as honored by prayers in English and Spanish than he is in Hebrew. And I think the idea is for a diversity of nations to come around the throne to worship God. And I think that the New Testament is quite clear that when Gentiles want to follow Jesus, that they don't have to become Jewish to do so. So although I talk in my book about why Sinai still matters, and I think the laws are still relevant to us and we need to put them into practice, I'm not saying we implement them exactly as written, because our cultural context has changed. And so I think that like trying to live like we're ancient Israelites is not the solution, because God loves all cultures and languages.
Well, thanks for joining me today, Professor Imes.
You bet. Thanks for having me, Jacob. Great questions.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.